Good evening, everyone, and it's a pleasure to have such a diverse audience join us today for this important discussion on the resurgence of military coup in the Sahel and the future of democracy in Africa. My name is Lukong Stella Shulika. I'm a research fellow at the Institute for the Future of Knowledge, University of Johannesburg. Before proceeding, I would like to extend my gratitude to my colleagues at the Institute, especially Dr. Oluwaseun Tella, who is my host, and Ms. Sandy Nomvele for their support in making this event possible. At the Institute for the Future of Knowledge, we are dedicated to understanding the relationship between knowledge and the future for the purpose of improving both. So on behalf of the Institute, you are welcome to this important and timely event. Discussing the resurgence of military coup in the Sahel and the future of democracy in Africa is a complex yet very relevant topic that has drawn significant attention both regionally and globally. Africa, as we know, has long been a continent wrestling with the complex relationship between democracy, authoritarianism, and external influences. The continent's journey towards stable democracy, which began in the late 1980s to the early 1990s, has been marked by persistent security challenges, such as conflict, terrorism, coup d'etat, as well as civil and organized rebellions. Albeit these challenges, significant progress towards democratic governance has been achieved over time, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa. Still, the threat of coup d'etat continues to hover over several regions, most notably the Sahel. Sudan, Mali, Chad, Guinea, Burkina Faso, and Niger in the Sahel region, and now Gabon in the Central Africa region, are few of the countries that have experienced military takeovers in Africa. These waves of military takeovers persist regardless of the African Union and regional economic community's strong position against unconstitutional changes of government in Africa. While the Sahel is no stranger to political instability, including Islamist terrorist insurgencies, the resurgence of military takeovers in the region further weakens the ability of states to manage security challenges effectively. Today, the question of state stability in the Sahel region has become prominent on the regional and international agendas, which focus on the drivers and dynamics of coup d'etat and their implications for the future of democracy across the African continent. On the global stage, the international community seems to be divided in its response to these political dynamics in the Sahel. While some countries, governments, and institutions condemn these unconstitutional changes of government and impose sanctions, others maintain strategic relations with coup leaders. At the continental level, opinions on these coup d'etats vary. On the one hand, some assert that they signify an important turning point in Africa's journey towards development and empowerment, and represent an ongoing process of structuration and Africa's reawakening. While on the other hand, others contend that these military takeovers are simply perpetuating existing power structures, advancing neocolonial agendas, violating state constitutions, deepening patterns of instability across the Sahel region, and threatening the democratic aspirations of the African continent. But whether these coups d'etat undermine the fundamentals of democratic governance and the rule of law, or reveal the fragility of democratic institutions in the Sahel and Africa at large, whether they signify a volatile turn towards democratic backsliding, or pose a critical challenge to the trajectory of democracy in Africa, are all inquiries subject to discussion. So What is to be done, and where does this leave us? I am happy that we have a distinguished panel of speakers and thought leaders to engage this discussion and share their insights. At this point, I would like to introduce the chair of today's event, Dr. Adeoye Akinola, who is the head of research and teaching at the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation here at the University of Johannesburg. Dr. Akinola, Mr. Chair, over to you and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shulika, and thanks so much for putting me on this hot seat. As you have said, I will be the one sharing today's conversation, and I'm particularly happy because I've seen the best brains on the continent on seat as well. And that gives me confidence that the theme of the conversation will be holistically engaged. Maybe I should start by stating my own preferred understanding of military coup by Mark Gowon and Johnson, who at a point in time argued that a military coup is an event in which the existing regimes are suddenly and illegally displaced by the action of relatively small groups, in which members of the military, members of the police, and the security forces of the state play an active role, either on their own or in conjunction with a number of civil servants or politicians. And I also make this note that the first military coup in Africa actually occurred in Egypt in July 1952. And the latest coup was the one that we witnessed in Gabon just last month. Of course, in the last few days, we have also heard of an attempt in Burkina Faso to also topple the military regime in the country. Early this year, the UNDP, they recorded at least 98 successful coups in 70 years. That is between 1952 and 2022. Africa may be entertained at least 98 successful military coups. And within that 70 years, Africa was only able to enjoy 25 years of existence without military coup. Now that means that per average 1.4 military coup occur per year in Africa since 1952. And between 1952 and the end of 2022, only 21 countries in Africa are yet to experience any form of military coup. So how do we see the recent waves of coup, particularly in the Sahel? And that's reoccurrence of what some people will refer to as a resurgence of military coup, particularly in the Western Sahel region, has pushed the issues of governance deficit, economic decline, maybe insecurity, democratic autocracy, power consolidation, unconstitutional tenure elongation, as well as the nationalistic tendencies that we have seen, particularly in the Francophone Sahel. It has pushed this to the fore. However, we have also argued for a reflection on the internal dynamics of African military hierarchies, their officer cliques, and their corporate and personal ambitions, which also propel them to grab power at some point. This meeting today will specifically engage the connection between military coup in the Sahel and democratic consolidation in Africa. And we have three panelists waiting to speak. I need to also apologize on behalf of Ms. Hassan, who couldn't attend this meeting for personal reasons. I apologize on her behalf, but I am confident that the three panelists we have on seat will do justice to trying to help us unravel this connection. And the question we're asking is, are military coups a threat to democratic consolidation in Africa? Other people will also argue on the other side to say, are military coups, particularly as we have seen now, trying to consolidate democracy on the continent, because people will argue about a civilian autocracy. But let me introduce the panelists who will actually engage this conversation. And please, I think it's important that the panelists will understand that they will only speak for 15 minutes. But the first on the list will be Dr. Charles Njukwenge, who is an international consultant, an African peace and conflict analyst in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. That's the seat of power. I'm sure his office is closer to the AUC than to us. Then we also have our own Professor Kabele Matlosa, who is the former Director for Political Affairs of the African Union Commission in Ethiopia. We also have our own Professor Tim Muriti, also an extraordinary professor, who is the head of the Peace Building Interventions Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation in Cape Town, South Africa. Thank you, my panelists, and I will start with Dr. Charles. Dr. Charles, if I may ask you, what are the socio-economic and political factors driving military coups in the Sahel? Over to you, Dr. Charles.
Thank you so much, Ade, for having me, and thank you, IKS, for having me. And I'm very grateful to the eminent panelists that I share the podium with. By no means can I claim exclusive knowledge in this area, because I've worked in the margins and under the leadership, the continental leadership of Dr. Matlosa, who is one of the panelists. But before I respond to your question, Chair, may I make two important remarks. The first is that whatever I'm going to say in these conversations by no means indicates that I endorse or support coups, and I disavow any form of force or use of arms or their abuse. The second, Chair, is that coup celebrations, as we have seen, seem to have engendered a mixed message that the people support coups. I believe the contrary. I think the people celebrate the fall of despotic leaderships and the fragmentation of leaders that are driven by foreign interest. So, having prefaced that, Chair, may I say that coups that have resurged have largely been driven by two factors. The first are the internal factors, which I'm going to speak very quickly to four of them, and the second are the external factors, or those which are driven by the normative or the institutions of the continent. If we have to look briefly at the internal factors, Chair, the first thing which I want to underscore is that coups as they are today, and the literature on coups dates as far back as 1950s on the continent. Some of that literature was researched in the 1980s, and that literature remains relevant today in explaining why we have coups. But one of the things which seem to occur today, which may not have been covered in literature, is the fact that soldiers, first and foremost, are citizens. I think this cannot be stated, this cannot be overstated. Soldiers, first and foremost, are citizens. So when citizens have issues, those issues most likely affect soldiers. Chair, I would like to reflect on an incident which I had on an airport in Kinshasa in 2011. I was traveling on a UN flight and going to the Eastern DRC. There I met a young Congolese soldier who had just been transferred. With his mission order, he was supposed to join a mission in the Eastern DRC. At the airport, he was refused to board because he had to pay $50, which is a tariff imposed by the Congolese government for anybody that uses a Congolese aeroplane. So the UN had no option than to insist that he has to pay this amount. And this gentleman going to his new duty station had nothing but $30 on him. He took out his beret from his head and threw it on the ground and said, this is the reason why soldiers join rebellions in this country. And today I reflect on that, and I think in some other places, they would not say this is the reason why soldiers join rebellions. They would say this is the reason why coups occur on this continent. Because issues of soldiers are treated very marginally by leaders. As such, soldiers at some point get so despondent and have to take matters into their hands. The second internal issue is the delicate role that militaries play in a state. Soldiers are responsible for protecting the territorial integrity of states, ensuring that the country is free from foreign attack, including war. But in several cases, Chair, we have seen that soldiers have even been brought to reinforce the work of the police when it has been weakened. Critical examples, for instance, in South Africa, we can cite when soldiers were brought in to enforce the lockdowns, and when soldiers were also brought in to deal with issues of looting in July 2021. Chair, the fact of the matter is that when a state does not support soldiers to meet these core duties towards the citizens and towards the sovereignty of the state, when governors do not support soldiers towards meeting this, they leave the lives of the soldiers so vulnerable that sometimes the best way to fight and to protect their own lives is actually to take matters into their hands. Thirdly, Chair, the ethnicization of armed groups and the proliferation of small arms, including, amongst others, in the hands of allied security or vigilante groups. When the state police is stretched thin, they are open to concepts such as community policing forum, or they're open to private security arrangements, which in essence have the license to own arms. Some of these grow to the point where they can actually rival state control. And these are things which engender or which lead to coups. I want to cite an example, for instance, of Sudan, where you find two allied armies fighting against each other. This is because at the time, Omar al-Bashir decided to create an allied army, which he hoped that in the event where the national army was not supportive of his rule, that this allied army was going to protect him. And now when al-Bashir left and the power vacuum occurred, these two militaries started fighting one another. We can also cite the case, for instance, of Cameroon, where you have the National Defense Force, you have the Presidential Guard, and you have the special forces called BIR. These are all different military structures which enjoy different forms of support, sometimes created along ethnic lines, and these are just dangers and perils, which point to the fact that coups are just imminent in such situations. And lastly, in terms of the internal drivers of coups, I'd like to state the failure of constitutional reform of the constitutions to reform governance and bring transformation. We have leaders on the continent who have been there for 30, 40 years, and they have no signs of relinquishing power. Yet we say that there is democracy, we say that there is governance, we say that there is constitutionalism. These are just indications that constitutionalism and governance are weak in those countries. Because if constitutions can facilitate transformations, there wouldn't be a need, for instance, we will not see coups research as they are, and with the celebration or the salutation of the people. And now, Chair, if you permit me, let me look at the external drivers of these coups. And I want to look specifically at two external drivers. First is the African Union and the Rex's adoption of post-coup transitional arrangements. I think that this is an arrangement which seems to encourage coups, because when a coup leader succeeds to overthrow a sitting head of state, and all that the African Union or the Rex can do is to suspend with the view of, after a few days of negotiation, allow them to continue to rule the matters of the country in the guise of they are just a transitional leadership. This is only an encouragement, because in most cases, most of those who led these coups live with presidential entitlements. And this is something which needs to be reviewed. I was speaking to the director a few minutes ago about the case in Burkina Faso in 2014, where despite the fact that the population rose and overthrew Blaise Compaoré, instead of the Union, of the African Union and ECOWAS, insisting that the constitutional process and whoever had to take over in terms of the constitution should take governance, the approach was to go for a transitional arrangement. And if we continue to go for these transitional arrangements and forget that even at the times when there are coups, that constitutions exist. We're only helping to validate this as a means for some soldiers to actually take over power. We can see this as well. This was an approach, for instance, which Morsi also used in Egypt, and it was very comfortable. He knew that the African Union had suspended Egypt, but he also knew that it was just a matter of time. And yes, indeed, it was a matter of time. Mali, the same thing. Burkina Faso, the same thing. Guinea, the same thing. Niger is very comfortable. They know that they have been suspended, but they also know that it's just a matter of time. And this matter of time is even very much proven because Gabon is already seemingly enjoying the support of the international community, as evidenced by the French ambassador going to salute the new transitional leader. Secondly, in terms of the external drivers of coups, the normative frameworks of the African Union at 20 today leave a lot for reflection. If we have to look, for instance, at the Constitutive Act, whilst the Constitutive Act envisaged that there would be situations of coups and enshrined in its Article 7H that these should be frowned against, the Constitutive Act did not envisage a situation where there will be unconstitutional preservation of power or institutionalized coups led by civilians. And so when we condemn coups led by the military and we endorse those led, for instance, by civilians, that creates a double standard, which requires a reflection on the normative frameworks of the continent. The second normative framework which I can cite is the ACDEC, the African Charter on Democracy, Election, and Good Governance. I'm fully aware of the fact that Director McLaughlin, at his time in the African Union, was working towards the review of this so that we can capture the concept of popular uprisings, because of the realization that there could be situations where we are sitting with governments that the people no longer want, but the constitutional path to take those people out is either constricted or inexistent. And that in such cases, it would be important to allow the will of the people to thrive. This has been the case, for instance, in several countries, and somewhere it has been saluted as a good thing, but good thing which in and by itself still falls under the definition of coups. So the combination of these internal and external factors leave important normative, doctrinal, and operational vacuums which have foreborne the resurgence of coups today. And now the question, Chair, what future for these coups? I think what we're going to see going forward is that there's an urgency for a review and for an overhaul of the continental normative frameworks to be more inclusive of circumstances which abuse of power and institutions would engender. I know that it will be prescriptive to think about what would happen in 5 years, but at the very least, we need to be mindful of the fact that when people abuse power, what would happen? The US Constitution, written 200 years ago, has stood the test of time because at the very least, it indicated that if at some point someone abuses state power, certain mechanisms would come into play. And I think that the normative frameworks of the continent would have to look at that so that we don't find ourselves dilly-dallying when different forms of coups actually emerge. The second, in terms of the way forward, the appreciation of the cardinal role of the military in the lives of the state. I think that oftentimes our condemnation of coups seem to forget that when the military remains vulnerable and thus the countries remain vulnerable to external attacks, because the military can very easily be bribed, such as the case of my friend that I met at the airport in Kinshasa, that such arrangements engender conflicts, that the conversations of today and the conversations of tomorrow are going to have to think about what we can do to ensure the sacrosanct of the place of the military in the lives of the state so that they do not have to infringe in governance. And lastly, Chair, you would be aware that in 2025, the African Union will be electing a new chairperson. And the African Development Bank as well will be electing a new president. The Economic Commission of Africa today is in the process of searching for an executive secretary. These are 3 leading African institutions which are in the process of finding new leadership. It is important that this new leadership comes with a vigor to deal with these issues, but more focus on bringing people at the center of governance and ensure that governance is not just spoken about, but that it is led and driven by the people. And this, in essence, means that governance should have to think of the people's needs in terms of 5 different structures. The first is people's needs in Africa, food self-sufficiency. The time is gone when we say that the continent has 65% of the world's arable land, that people die of famine, that there has to be industrialization and job creation on the African continent. That's in the second instance. The time has come when we have to really sit and say, China has a population of 1.4 billion, which the leverage for their development. Africa equally has a population of 1.4 billion, but Africa, more than China, has natural resources, but Africa has fewer industries here. Thus, urgently, there's a need for industrialization, for job creation, so that the third issue, which I'm going to mention now, migration and trade imbalances, global and continental, can be addressed. The fourth issue is our educational systems. The educational systems which leaves many youth with certificates and no jobs is only an indication that our educational system seems to be failing. Our educational system is not engendered to address the challenges which we're facing on this continent. And lastly, Chair, there's a need for the reconceptualization of what our African Union and African institutions are working on. The concept of peace and security really needs to be revisited. It really needs to be revisited. The continent should be talking about peace consolidation and democratic strengthening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charles. And I think I enjoyed your conversation, and I think you are able to, frontally engage the socio-economic and political factors that are responsible for military coup in the Sahel. And maybe I should just mention one thing that fascinates me, which some of the time we forget, is the fact that the military are actually part of the people. They are citizens of their respective countries. Without presenting myself, let me quickly invite Professor Kabele Matlosa, who is the former Director of Political Affairs of the African Union Commission. Professor Matlosa, over to you.
Thank you very much, moderator and my colleague Oye. And let me thank Olu and his team for this excellent platform that they've organized for us, and Dr. Stella Shiluka for opening our meeting. I'm going to, and I'm happy that Charles spoke before me, because I'm just going to build on some of the points he has made, and then zero in on what I want to contribute to this debate. Let me start. Okay, I'm going to do just 5 things. I'm going to talk to 5 issues mainly. What is our understanding? What is our understanding of the unconstitutional change of government in Africa and the place of military coups within that? 1. 2, I'll just list what I will call 3 core drivers of unconstitutional change into the military coups. Those are the deep-seated, what I would call deep-seated drivers that are deep-seated within the society and the economy. I'll build on Charles on that point. And then 8 key catalysts. And I'm not going to discuss this because Charles has done justice to this. I'm just going to do this debate. I'm going to zero in, I'm going to go deeper on the AU response and what I call at the end, with the democracy. Where is our democracy going? So I'm going to do that quickly. So let's just move quickly. I'll skip the contextual because I think Oye and Dr. Shiluka have done justice to that. Let me go quickly to the understanding. Yes, yeah. I want to propose that we can't understand fully or adequately military coups without contextualizing the coups within the broader concept of unconstitutional change of government or unconstitutional changes of government. And therefore, we have to start there as a broader concept. And within, since the past 5 years, in fact, we have seen a trend, and I think the previous speakers have said this, a trend where this UCG has become another pandemic within the health pandemic that we witnessed of the COVID in 2020-21. We're now we're now experiencing a political pandemic that has come during the COVID and continuing after the COVID. In the form of military coups that have happened, as we know, Mali, 2 of them, Guinea, 1, Sudan, 2, Burkina Faso, 2, and Oye just referred to an attempted now. I was not even aware of that one. Niger, there was an abortive coup and a successful one. And Gabon, won a successful coup. And within the African Union framework, as Charles referred to, the 6 countries that have experienced military coups have had to be subjected to sanctions by the African Union, as per the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council, as well as ACDEC. However, we have to also be mindful of the inconsistency of our union in responding to these incidences on the continent, where we have also, in some instances, applied soft glove, what I would call soft glove response to UCG, and as a result, therefore, encouraging them indirectly. This happened in 2013, military coup in Egypt, shielded as popular protest. A similar coup of the same nature in Zimbabwe in 2017, and a coup in Chad in 2021, and another one that's actually even unfolding now as we speak in Tunisia through the Kais Saied power grab. So these are some of the instances that we need to be mindful of as one to understand these dynamics on the continent. Therefore, military coups are therefore a subset of UCG, and the UCG is defined clearly in the 2 instruments of our continent, the ACDEC and the Lome declaration that we'll speak to later on. But quickly, what are the core drivers? Because these are the drivers that are deep-seated and are not easy to see or resolve, in a short space of time. I categorize this into three parts: the economic crisis, and I think Charles referred to this, the crisis of the state itself, and the crisis of governance. And if we want to go to the root cause of addressing military coups, we therefore have to find a way of addressing these 3 types of crisis: economic crisis, crisis of the state, and crisis of governance. Let's look at the triggers or catalysts, what I call catalysts. The 8 of them, I'm just going to list them because Charles has discussed some of these. Contested elections is one trigger. Corruption is another. External interests and illicit financial outflows is another. Manipulation of constitutions for tenure elongation is another factor. And then we have politicization of security and securitization of politics is another factor. Popular protests is another one. Terrorism and violent extremism is yet another one. And mercenarism is yet another. So those are the 8 I want to contribute to the discussion by Charles. Now, let me go into the AU response. We can categorize the AU response into successes and failures, in my view. The successes revolve around 2 main elements: the development of the requisite normative framework. I think the AU has done an excellent job in developing the normative framework against military coups or against unconstitutional change of government, starting with the Lome declaration, and then we have ACDEC. And then, besides the normative frame, we have also established, the AU has also established requisite institutional arrangements in the form of the Peace and Security Council, as well as the African peer review mechanism. But there have been failures. Let's not shy away from that. We have had failures in the AU response. One, there's poor commitment of AU member states to ratify, domesticate, and implement the norms, and Charles has referred to this, including the ACDEC in particular. 2, there's narrow national sovereignty versus pooled sovereignty. Countries tend to cling to their own narrow national sovereignty and avoid pooling sovereignty for purposes of advancing continental agenda. 3rd, intergovernmental body. The AU is an intergovernmental body and therefore is constrained in terms of its effectiveness to respond to this crisis situations, because it is not a supranational entity like the EU. It is not. So it's a problem that we have. Fourth, challenges facing the AU-REX arrangements. There is this twin concept of complementarity and subsidiarity. It is not working all the time. We have seen this complementarity, subsidiarity working more effectively in regions like West Africa with ECOWAS, where ECOWAS is more proactive than other RECs. But it has not worked well in other regions such as East Africa. So ECOWAS, if you look at the case of the Gambia, it has worked. But in East Africa, it didn't work in the case of Burundi. And then finally, in the failures, overwhelming dominance of external interests, the colonial legacies, external interests that still come to bear on our continent is a challenge. So let's ask ourselves then a question. With a democracy, and I want to propose, as I close my discussion, that democracy is in crisis. And this is not just in Africa, it's globally. But Africa is not an exception here. It is also in crisis here in Africa. And this crisis manifests in different ways. We have seen this in the form of Africans increasingly losing faith in elections and democracy. Africans are increasingly losing faith in elections and democracy. Voter turnout is declining precipitously in many countries. Public trust in governance is also in decline, especially with regard to elective institutions. Public trust is relatively high for religious and traditional institutions, as well as the army, compared to parliaments, judiciary, executive, and political parties, for example. And Africa's governance, therefore, this is my proposal, my proposal as I conclude. There is need for us to find a way of, injecting transformation into Africa's governance system. The current liberal democracy, in my view, needs to be transformed into a developmental democracy on the continent if you are to see progress on the democratization and peace building front. The kind of democracy we have is not saving the continent at all. In fact, when you see people going to the streets celebrating after coups, it's a mistake, and I want to agree with Charles. The mistake to think that people are supporting coups. No, people are celebrating because they are dissatisfied with the kind of democracy they have, and therefore they take the leaders that have been deposed as people responsible for this. So it's not so much that they're celebrating coups, but they're actually expressing their dissatisfaction with the democracy on offer in the continent. Liberal democracy is failing our continent. We need a different type of democracy, and that type of democracy should still be anchored on universal values and principles of democracy that we all know, but it should have a specific African characteristics. And I just list this as 4. 1, it should be a decolonized democracy. 2, it should be an Africanized democracy. 3, it should be a type of democracy that transcends civil liberties and political rights per se, but extends to socioeconomic and cultural rights. And finally, it must be an inclusive, consensual, and consociational democracy. This is the kind of democracy that we need, because this kind of democracy, the one I've just outlined here, would then speak to the peculiar socioeconomic and political context of our continent. And it should also be anchored within the larger spirit of Pan-Africanism. I want to submit, Chair.
Thank you so much, Professor Kabeli Matlosa. Of course, it's really an impressive conversation, but I didn't expect less. Maybe I should also use this opportunity to say a little word about Professor Matlosa. That he is the author of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance, which was adopted by the African Union on 30 January 2007. and actually came into force in 2012 following its ratification by 5 African states and members of the AU. Thank you, Professor, and I love what you have just said, that apparently liberalism has failed. May it be political liberalism, economic, or even cultural. That's a statement of fact, and thank you for reinforcing that. Also, I love how you concluded that we need to Africanize or domesticate the kinds of democracy that African states are actually adopting. But without wasting time, let me call on our own extraordinary professor, Tim Moriti, who is the head of the Peace Building Interventions Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliations in Cape Town, South Africa. Professor Moriti, I think we will be interested in understanding African peace and security architecture and the future of democracy on the continent. Professor Moriti, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akinola, and also to the team. Thank you, Dr. Stella also for organizing this very important meeting, and to the fellow panelists for their remarkable insights. I'm going to try my best to respond to your question, Dr. Akinola, touch a little bit upon some of the framing that we have within the AU Accra Declaration on Unconstitutional Changes of Government of 2022, last year. And then I want to maybe segue just very briefly into looking at foreign military bases and how they're also contributing towards instability, which I think has relevance for the Sahel. And then touch upon the phenomenon of Franc-Afrique, which I believe brings us to one of the more recent coups in Niger, and conclude with this brief discussion about what Prof. Matlosa has asked us to think through, an indigenous African notion of democracy at once decolonized and Africanized, which I think gives us a key research and policy agenda going forward. Indeed, we haven't really defined what we mean by democracy in Africa. So I think the Accra Declaration of 17th March 2022 was very clear in rejecting any form of internal interference on the African continent, particularly those who are financing coups, foreign fighters, mercenaries, and nefarious actors who are actually undermining the efforts to promote peace and security. Also called for the full operationalization of the African standby force, something I think we don't discuss sufficiently, and I think we should also put on the table. The standby force would be the institution that could actually intervene in situations where weak African states are in peril, and rather than bringing on board all these private military forces that are in fact undermining peace and stability on our continent. And then I think the phenomenon of military bases on the African continent, foreign military bases, is something that we cannot ignore. It's clear that the whole world has come to intervene in Africa for their own interests. We're obviously familiar with the 2011 NATO bombing of Libya, which in fact the US-led, US, France, UK, NATO bombardment of Libya, which in fact has catalyzed the instability and the chaos that we see in the Sahel, and has perpetuated the escalation of the violent extremism, radicalized, religious political actors spreading across the Lake Chad region, and also threatening the southern coastal states in West Africa. So clearly, we have to locate this foreign presence, this foreign intervention as an additional catalyst. It fits into Prof. Matlosa's list of the catalysts. In 2014, France further contributed to the militarization of the region by establishing the joint force of the Group of Five, known as the G5 Sahel military formation, which included Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger. And this militarization, in fact, as we can see now with France's recent announcement that it will be withdrawing from Niger, that this was not a successful operation. In fact, was an abject failure, which means that tremendous amount of resources were spent on the hardware and the fighting and the kinetic action, which in fact did not lead to the outcomes that the original mission had set out to achieve. And also, I think it's important to note that France has at least 10 military bases across African countries. US has at least 29 military bases across the continent. Russia's Wagner Group has a presence and has had a presence in about 8 countries. United Kingdom, China also act in a number of African countries. The UK is in Djibouti, Kenya, Malawi, Mali, Niger, Sierra Leone, Somalia. China has obviously a operational base for its People Liberation Army in Djibouti, and is increasing to other countries its presence in places like Sudan. So these foreign military bases, I think, do not contribute towards efforts to promote peace. If anything, I would say they are part of the catalyst. They are used sometimes quite strategically to, in fact, undermine governments in some parts of the continent, and in fact are contributing to military coups in their own right. The US has a very significant drone base in Agadez in Niger, which is now the country of contestation. And I think this is why even far back as 2016, the African Union Peace and Security Council, which is responsible, in fact, it's the primary institution responsible to address this issue, noted with deep concern the existence of foreign military bases and challenged and questioned the illegal transfer of arms and ammunition to non-state actors across the continent, which in fact has created this very volatile situation that we're in. So I think that's an important factor to put on the table. And then linked to that very closely is obviously the legacy of France-Afrique, or Franc-Afrique, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and the French colonialism on peace and security in Africa. And we're talking about the Sahel. So I think we should zero in on France-Afrique. Following 1885 European scramble for Africa, by France colonized a significant portion of the African continent. By 1960, it had almost 5 million square kilometers, Western Central Africa, which is more than 10 times the size of France. Something that it held throughout the Second World War, when it was being even occupied by Germany. But France succeeded in binding these countries to its monetary system known as the Communauté Financière Africaine, CFA, which compelled these post-colonial African countries in the Francophone region, we call it Francophone region, to deposit half of their foreign currency reserves in the Banque de France in Paris. And so this really is meant that France treated these countries, and in fact continues to treat some of these countries in Africa as colonial possessions, simply privileged markets where they can extract and transfer, which means that in fact our countries, our Francophone brothers and sisters, did not really have the sovereignty that they assumed to have. In fact, in a strange way, it is now with the closure, in the case of Niger, with the statement that Macron's statement that France will retreat and will close its bases, maybe you're beginning to see the real decolonization of Niger, which is a paradox in terms, because it has happened through a military coup, and that is why we have this paradox of the so-called emancipatory coup. And it's very difficult to frame it, because on the one hand, as Dr. Charles said at the outset, we cannot endorse the use of violence and force to take over power. But when you have a civilian autocracy, as I think Dr. Akinola, you used the phrase, that is in fact actively involved in extracting resources and shifting them to the global north countries, that in itself is a form of an economic coup. And I think this is exactly the case that we're dealing with, not only in Niger. I think you see it happening in Gabon. It just happened in Gabon. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Guinea historically also are very much in this category of countries, so-called democracies historically or previously, that in fact are autocracies that are siphoning resources outside of Africa for the benefit of the economic masters in the global north. In the case of Niger, it really is the ghosts of Franc-Afrique coming back to haunt the present. And France and the European Union are indeed key importers of Niger's uranium as we speak. The US conglomerate Chevron Texaco is in the process of building a $13 billion trans-Saharan gas pipeline, which will deliver gas directly to European homes from Nigeria through Niger to Algeria to Europe, to warm up the homes of Europe while the people of Niger languish with inadequate utility services, housing, healthcare, education. And this extraction was operationalized during former President Bazoum's rule. So it's evident that these transactional deals were not benefiting the people of Africa or the people of Niger, but the major geopolitical actors in the global north. So what do we do in that situation? Is it possible for us to have this concept of an emancipatory coup that leads to a deeper form of democracy down the line? And that's the big challenge, because are the power brokers who have taken over these countries militarily, in fact, going to hand power back to a civilian-led or people-driven system of governance? And so I think that is crucial going forward. And this brings us to the question of what is this form of democracy that then can step in to ensure that there's a closer link between the people who are governed and of Africa and the so-called governors. And I think this is one of the biggest challenges we have, and also the reason why we're seeing the spate of coups. These leaders, even though they're elected so-called democratically, insulate themselves from the people, they incubate themselves, and they continue in conducting massive corruption and extraction of resources, which impoverishes their own countries, which is the shocking thing, really, is they're impoverishing their own countries. And that's why we have young Africans risking their lives to cross the Mediterranean. And then the question becomes, okay, what sort of democracy then can we in fact design that will replace this liberal democratic system that is in fact part of a massive extractive machine? And it's also an appeal to the countries in the global north to stop preaching and to stop extracting from Africa as if it's their own extraction zone. And it's up to us as Africans to revive the spirit of Pan-Africanism, solidarity amongst each other, to in fact then find an indigenous African framework for democracy. Prof. Matlosa already began to give us very important contours there of decolonized democracy, Africanized democracy that is consensual, inclusive, consociational. And I think it's important to also go back to our pre-colonial times, where we did have forms of democracy. It was not an ideal situation, clearly. We did not have democratic tranquility. There was much contestation. There was political authority, though. And this political authority, even though it was and is still in some parts of the continent very gendered, patriarchal, male-centric, at times monarchical, autocratic, and even militaristic, there were still other forms of democracy that existed that were progressive. And I would say that these are the pre-colonial forms of democracy that we need to look into and distill whether, in fact, we can find important elements, positive aspects of indigenous culture, which promoted and enhanced democratic principles and practices in some of our societies. It's not going to be for all societies, it's going to be for some of them. And then we find ways to map out contours of an indigenous African framework for democracy as part of a much wider research and policy engagement agenda. I think it's very appropriate that University of Johannesburg is convening this meeting, because this is in fact this potentially could be a very important departure in terms of the kind of work we do as academics and policy analysts and those engaging with the policy world, to in fact begin to put this issue on the table. Because the question now will be, now you've got rid of Bazoum in Niger, what's going to happen next? Where do we go from here? Because if the military hands back to another Bazoum, you have exactly the same situation. Or the military itself will become, autocratic and refuse to hand over power. And the people will still be in a situation languishing in poverty. So I think it's a very important question, very timely webinar that this has been put together. And I think with my fellow panelists here, this is something that working together with the rest of the team that's convening this and some of the participants listening in, that this is something we should apply our minds to, find ways to establish those networks where we can actually begin to do this work of mapping out this Africanized and decolonized democratic system that will in fact hopefully work better for the African people. Thank you very much, Dr. Akinola.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Murithi, and thank you for the insights. Thank you for giving us some thoughts, which we usually call food for thought. And this is not only food, it's also wine for thought or drinks for thought. Thank you so much. And I know the audience are ready to engage with the panelists. I know that, but I love the way you also approach the militarization of Africans and the implications, particularly with all the foreign powers scrambling back, trying to gain more influence over the other. And one will also begin to wonder that why is it that where we have the UN peacekeeping forces for like 10 years, for more than 10 years, for 5 years, we still have insecurity, we still have terrorism, and we have military coups in the same country, and those foreign powers usually seem surprised to hear of military coup in the same countries where they have more than 1,000 military forces. So there are many complexities, there are complications, there are many questions to be asked. We have African Union, we have the APRM, we have NEP, we have ECOSOC, we have different African agencies in Africa, all of them trying to drive the development and the governance agenda of Africa, and yet Africa still finds itself in this situation. So there are many questions I know the panelists are prepared for, and maybe we should turn to our esteemed audience and ask them to ask their questions directly if they can. We would prefer you to raise up your hand, and I know Tandy will also assist to identify if there are any hands that have been raised so that you can join the conversation. It will be more engaging if people can just speak, if you can. So please, can we use the icon, the raising of your hand, so that if we identify anyone, then we can call. I can see, I think I can see 3 hands. Maybe I will start with Abutima. Theophilus Abutima, please let your question be very direct and very brief. And if it is a comment, please, can you just make it very direct? Thank you, Abutima. And if your question is addressed to a particular panelist, you can mention the name, but any of the panelists can respond as well. Abutima.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all the organizers for this timely webinar. It's very informing. Yeah, so my first question, I think it goes to all the 3 panelists. So, and considering the persistent nature of this coup in Africa, and we have an intergovernmental body like the AU, which is supposed to control this. So do we blame the AU for not being effective in anticipating this coup, considering the factors that cause coup in Africa that have been mentioned? These factors are always there for them to see, but yet they wait for the coups to happen before they now intervene. And sometimes we also think of national sovereignty. So should we restructure the AU in such a way that they have some powers that they can intervene and correct even democratic governments before this coup? Okay. And then my second question is the second speaker, considering a kind of a democracy that is more peculiar to Africa. Is he suggesting us that Africa will return to what we used to have before colonialism, maybe the rule by the monarchs, priests, or a hybrid of that sort? if you can throw more light on that and see how feasible that could be for Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We'll come back to you. Just want to take rounds of questions, then the panelists will come back. Nuruddin Aziz, I see your hand is up. Can you ask your questions? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I would like to congratulate the panelists for the insightful way they've presented their comments on this issue. I cannot agree more with Professor Matlosa on the proposal he has put on the table with regards to how we should move forward with regards to democratic governance on the African continent. Just like you said, Prof, I think there's a failure of liberal democracy on the continent, and there's no doubt about that. But in moving this forward, and I think Professor Muriti also alluded to this, there are a lot of things that we need to unpack. One of them is the AU itself as an organization, and I like the way you put it, that the AU is not a supranational organization. You see that if we continue this way, the way we are going, there's no hope for Africa, in my own view, because if you have the same heads of state who have stayed 40, 50 years, 30 years in power, who are still the same people that are taking decisions at the summit, then we are in crisis. The AU, I don't think there's any organization that works as fantastic as the African Union. But the problem has always been implementation. That is where our problem is. So if you continue this way, and I don't have a solution, I don't know if Professor Matlosa want to propose something, that if we continue to have it this way, that the same people who don't have any moral standing will still be the same people that are taking decisions on how the continent should be run, on how the AU should be run, then it is a non-starter. So there is a need for a total overhaul of the African Union if we need to move forward. Secondly, the military we talk about, the military is an instrument of the state. It's part of the state. It depends on, it's a tool, it's a political tool. If you have a tool and you don't know how to use it, it becomes counterproductive. I've heard people talking about the issue of presidential guard and so on and so forth. These are the misuse of the military. If you misuse it, if you have a tool and you don't know how to use it, it becomes counterproductive. So these are the 2 points I want to put on the table, and I don't know if Professor Matlosa will be able to, to come up with an idea of how we need to move forward on these new democratic thoughts, that Professor Muriti too have alluded to. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Nuruddin. Maybe I should take one more question, and I can see that Professor Jinodu wants to ask a question or a couple of questions. Professor Jinodu, over to you. Professor Jinodu, you are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
So let me start by thanking you and the organizers for this very interesting program, and also my very good friend, Tabele. I just have 2 comments to make. One is that we have a general theory, a general problem in explaining social change. And that is because there is always some kind of gap between what you may call predisposing causes and precipitating ones. When do the predisposing causes become precipitating? For example, we have very many countries, not only in Africa, we have the same set of material conditions that we explain in Africa do explain, and yet they don't have coup. Take India, for example. So what is it then? I mean, there must be something, there must be, I mean, the distinction between triggers that Kabili was referring to and the remote causes, sometimes there is very, very thin. So what really causes the trigger to trigger a rebellion for a coup, for example? Because if there are countries in the same material condition and you don't have coups, but there are others that have the same and they have coups. My second point is that, look, I think there has been an attempt to have an African theory of democracy, starting from the African Charter on Peoples and Human Rights, from the Charter on Popular Participation, from the ASDEG, other codes and standards that have been put forward to give an African content to democracy. And these are done by African intellectuals themselves. And the APRM, I mean, if you take the reference to social democracy, for example, the African Charter on Democracy is essential. I mean, the African Charter on Peoples and Human Rights is essentially a social democratic document. In fact, I've always argued that what really, that the African Charter on Human Rights is the first, I mean, the international organizations have generally refused to accept ethnic group rights as rights. They only understand individual rights. But the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, for the first time, really accepted that there are group rights, there are ethnic rights, there are group rights that must be considered. And that is why you have many African countries have the Chapter 2 equivalent of what we have in Nigeria or in Kenya. And yet most governments do not implement what their Chapter 2 provides. And I think part of the reason is because neoliberalism is globalized, and the IMF and the World Bank and others will not allow people-centered democracy where the state is actually the facilitator, the allocator of surplus. So I think the question is not really that we need to have an African concept of democracy. We have it in these 3 or 4 documents, but why are they not working? The APRM provides a basis for measuring the extent to which African countries, comply with Chapter 2, and recommendations are made. But those recommendations the whole question of enforcement is now become very, very important, and the role of the extra-African institutions to more or less marginalize APRM, working actively against APRM. I think that is another factor that we need to take. So those are just the 2 questions, the 2 comments I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Jinadu. Thank you for your comments. And that actually resonates with some of the concerns that people have been raising. Why are we having these waves of coups in Africa, not in other society with the same socio-economic and political reality, at least relatively? And maybe our panelists will comment on that. Let me take one more question, then we come back to the panelists. I can see Edwin Yingi. Will you proceed, Edwin?
Okay, thank you, Chair. My quick question is that I agree with the presenters that liberal democracy seem to be failing Africa, but my worry is the failure of liberal democracy in the African continent, and we are talking about a new form of democracy, decolonized democracy, if I might use the terms some of the presenters have used, an all-inclusive democracy. But my question is, do we see this working in Africa, in an African continent which is divided with the 54 countries? Because I'm asking this because what I've seen to be a challenge, and a challenge being faced by many regional bodies, is that they seem to face a hurdle of national sovereignty with countries, self-determination with countries. So I'm not sure that any form of liberal democracy, I mean any form of Africanized democracy, which might be proposed, and the African Union tried to implement that. Is it possible with the 54 countries as divided as they are? Maybe if the presenters can comment on that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Edwin. I think we should come back to our esteemed panelists and let's hear their response, their perspective to some of the issues that have been raised. May I also humbly inform you that Professor Kabele has another engagement and has to be excused from the meeting, but I trust that Professor Muriti and Dr. Charles will be able to adequately respond to some of the questions you had directed to Professor Kabele. So to our panelists, you can take the questions, you can respond to any of the questions, but maybe we take it in reverse form. So I will ask Professor Tim Muriti to respond first to some of the questions our participant raised, and you can also reflect on some of the comments. Please, if you can just take about 3 minutes to do that, so we will appreciate. Over to you, Professor Muriti.
Yes, so I agree with one of the panelists that, in fact, we do have some research already on what culturally indigenous forms of democracy in Africa might look like. There is some research out there. It still needs to be, I think, transformed into actionable principles that can be widely taught within our schools and ultimately begin to inform the Pan-African body politic so that this becomes the building blocks for our revival as a continent going forward. I think, yes, there's a point that we have these normative frameworks, but I think what you will find is that despite the normative frameworks, African Charter on Elections, Democracy and Governance, Lomé, protocol and constitutional change of government, that African governments have been, in fact, almost just paying lip service to these processes and have retained some of the colonial logic of the past. And so you find, in fact, what we have are hybrid, mutated forms of this liberal democratic system in some shape or form, very much mirroring those of the former colonial empires on the African continent. And I think that is a challenge. We really need to decolonize our thinking. Even some of our normative frameworks have infused some of these ideas into the lexicon of the documents, that actually they also need to be subject to decolonization. Dr. Matlosa, before we left the AU, was working on reviewing, re-engaging with the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Government. I think it's time to do that in a much more systematic way and to advance that cause going forward. And then I saw a question in the chats about Bazoum of Niger and whether or not in fact he was attempting to deal with the challenging issues in the country, and maybe that's the reason why he was deposed in the coup. But I think the bigger challenge is that, and reality is that Bazoum in fact presided over massive extraction in Niger. In 2022, almost 1,400 tons of uranium were exported from Niger to France. And even though Niger exports 3.5 billion euros of uranium, it only receives a very small portion back, like maybe 500 million euros, because of the costs, so-called cost of exploiting, the uranium. And UNDP, Human Development Index, places Niger as third from the bottom of the least developed countries in the world. That doesn't make any sense. If a country is making this much resources from uranium, the state of living, the well-being in Niger should be much higher. 90% of the people of Niger do not have any electricity. That is the real challenge in a society like that. And I think that's why the people came out to the street, and that's why they're quite angry with this overarching system of exploitation that is in fact not benefiting them. And I think that is something that we have to take on board, while asking the question of where to now in terms of, despite this emancipatory coup, where do we go from here in terms of rebuilding a system where there is transparency in governance and a citizen engagement, citizen participation in overseeing the processes of governance in the country. I think that is really at the heart of this notion of democracy that we should be distilling and driving forward. Let me stop there, Dr. Akinola.
Just let me quickly push you a little further, Professor Mulitsi. There's a question about the AU, and somebody is asking, what do we do with the AU? Because
the AU itself needs to undergo a certain degree of transformation as well. Now, this might sound strange because in 2016 there was a reform initiative that was launched by Paul Kagame. But that reform, in fact, has left a state of disorientation within the African Union. Morale is quite low within a number of departments at the AU. Systems are not necessarily working at the highest levels of efficiency. And then the key point is that the AU is still very much an intergovernmental organization, and it is not a supranational organization where everything was put in place for it to gradually transition towards becoming a supranational organization, with the African Union Commission having more executive powers, with the Pan-African Parliament in Midrand having not only deliberative processes, but legislative powers, and the African courts being able to preside and hold to account, African Union courts holding to account African governments and societies and actors within society. And the African Standby Force being operationalized, which hasn't been operationalized for 22 years, is still on standby mode, which is not good for a standby force. And that is down to inertia, bureaucratic inertia, political fear of the potential overreach of a supranational organization, which is all valid, but at the same time, as an African continent, we really cannot address our internal challenges and at the same time also assert our voice on the global stage unless we revive the spirit of Pan-Africanism and we become serious about doing so, including the issuing of the African Union passport to all 1.3, 1.4 billion Africans so that we can have this freedom of movement. Protocol on the free movement of people has been on the cards for a long time. There is some pushback by this tendency to want to shift back to nationalism. But in a world where we are now, we can see radical shifts in the global order and a case for transforming multilateralism. If we remain in our small silos of nation states, artificial, constructed by the Europeans, we will be left behind in this major transition that is happening as we speak right now. And so the African Union itself needs to paradoxically undergo another process of transformation and change management. It sounds strange to say, but that is exactly what we need. And I think this time it is towards the embryonic building blocks of a supranational institution, no longer this secretariat format that is in fact not served the continent for the last 2 decades. That's really where we need to be thinking and heading to. Dr. Akinola.
Thank you so much, Professor Mulitsi. Let me come back to Dr. Charles. Dr. Charles, can you respond to some of these questions? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think the questions that you are referring to, they are more of comments, which invite all of us to reflect. But if I have to say, I would really speak to 2 or 3 quick things. The first is that the state remains an important actor in whatever transformation that the continent has to go through. It's what structure that the state has to take that is actually debatable, because it is the different homeostasis that the state has undergone, or the lack thereof of transformation, that has led us to return to coups. So we need to appreciate that, even if we are going to talk about the transformation of the African Union, as Professor Moriti is mentioning right now, that we need the states to actually drive this, and this conversation as well, or the states have to take their mandate from the people. It makes no sense that when we have conversations like these, that we are not even aware of the fact that in 2025, the African Union will be electing new chairperson, and that people who are contesting for those positions are former ministers who are redundant, who have nothing to offer, and that we just wait for chance to actually happen. I think that amongst the guests, there are people who can actually lead these continental spaces. There are youth as well. We have seen that amongst the in the transformation that is happening worldwide, that you are seeing more and more young faces that are actually emerging, and countries have not fallen. The states leaders that we have today, who have led for 20, 30, and 40 years, like the case of Cameroon, that they came to power when they were actually in their 30s and in their early 40s. They did not run the state aground. So there is hysteria to say that the youth are a danger, or especially the youth in the military. And I think it is that hysteria that is blinding analysts from condemning institutional coups when they are led by civilians, and thinking that it is better to condemn those that are led by the military. That said, as far as what can be done, I mentioned in my opening remarks that governance has to be about the bread and butter issues that the people aspire to. Number one, that food self-sufficiency must be a thing on this continent, and that people should no longer have one meal or go to bed hungry on this continent. I also mentioned that the population of this continent is as sizable as that of China, 1.4 billion people, and that China leverages from that population to drive the global economy. We can do the same if we engage new social contracts with the international community, such that industries are built here. China leveraged on that, and most industries are built in China or in South Korea to produce the laptops, the computers that we use, the cell phones that we use. But those natural resources, those raw materials, leave from the African continent. We need to be a part of this conversation. And it is our absence from these global spaces that continue to leave despondency in the continent and create spaces that are being taken over by the militaries. I also mentioned that we have the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which is a huge opportunity to advance conversations such as what Professor Moriti has mentioned, the free movement of people on the African continent. It is inconceivable that Europeans can move across Africa far fluently than Africans can move in their own continent. And who has the power of movement? You would even see that in the appellation that Europeans are considered expatriates, they are considered tourists, but when Africans have to move across Africa, they are considered pests, they are considered xenophobes, they are considered illegal immigrants, and all of these things are only driving despondency on the African continent and creating spaces that militaries are actually taking over. They are indirectly feeding on the desperation of the Africans. And the educational system of Africa needs to be looked into. We can no longer continue studying history or political science using the books which are from the global north. Political science from the global north, I would take, for instance, the United States. That is a country with one political party separated by one or two key issues. In Africa, the concept of democracy, you have multiple parties. The political science that we study in school can therefore no longer be a model for political science on the African continent. And the conversations around traditional authorities, those conversations are welcomed, particularly in the light of the fact that these are not models which are just completely far off. Somaliland today is ruled through a traditional system. The West finds it difficult to understand their electoral system, but their electoral system works. And the margins of Somaliland, Somalia remains unstable, but Somaliland is working. Gaddafi's Libya was working. How Gaddafi structured it? Gaddafi ruled with the collaboration of 60 traditional leaders who were heads of traditional counties. These knew who was new in the community. These had a list of people in the community and made sure that everyone had the essential services, thus anchoring the point of Dr. Matlosa that democracy needs to be about the bread and butter issues that the people need. And finally, Chair, the conversation about when we say the African Union, what does it do? Largely, people think that the African Union is there to promote or to maintain peace and security on the continent. We need to decolonize that mentality that we are talking about peace and security. This continent is not at war. 4 countries in instability out of 55 countries does not mean that the country is burning. There are more opportunities for development. There are more opportunities for resilience on this continent than there are perhaps anywhere else, but we need to tap into them. And that's where the conversation should be. Because if we do not have those conversations, we are only going to allow spaces for the vulnerable, and these spaces shall be taken advantage of by the militaries. Thank you. Over to you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Dr. Charles. For those comments, I think the conversation will continue as you have said. But maybe we should just take 2 more questions and come back to our panelists to respond and give their last comments. I'm checking if I can see hands up. I know Elvis' hand was up before. Okay, Nobat, do you want to go first? And I will come back to you, Elvis. Nobat, can you quickly give your questions or comments? Please make it very concise. Thank you.
I have 3 questions. The first one is more like a comment that, yes, we have been talking about the African form of democracy, which, of course, Professor Kwesi Weredu actually elaborated so much around consensus democracy. But my question is, how can we actually apply this consensus democracy looking at other factors, demographic factors that can actually act as constraint within our continent, preventing this issue of peace or actually contributing to the issue of conflict within our African context? The second question is, Professor Tim was mentioning the different military from the global north, as I can put it, how they have been in Africa for peacekeeping mission, which that peacekeeping mission has actually failed. But the question is that the academicians who are African in mind, not just African, what framework are they suggesting to the African military who are actually taking the case of Niger at the moment that can actually bring transformation within our own African context? Because in some countries, we just see military, some of them as subjected to a lot of torture, in which, of course, they listen to the chief commander, not because they can't actually rebel or they can't take over, just because maybe they are still looking for a better way forward. So the academia, what transformative framework are they suggesting that some of these countries, whereby they're actually looking for how the military can take over, how it can actually work? The third question that I might like to ask is, of course, one of the key speakers was actually talking about education, the last speaker. Now, the question that we are saying that there is need for transformation within our education setup, the question is, what nature of education can actually be applicable in Africa? Look, in the case, you was just talking about political science. That's just one out of many. We study chemistry, we study many subjects, in which at the end of the day, you don't see how applicable it is within our own African context. They give us theory, but when it comes to practice, they practice it. So the question is, what nature of education, what type of education are they actually, are we going back to the different forms? Last but not the least, of course, one of the speakers was talking about the different form of democracy that existed before the colonization. And he went further to mention that in some countries, it can't actually be applicable. My question is, why and to what extent can it not be applicable in some societies? If those different forms of democracy, which were actually applied in pre-colonial time, work effectively, how can it not be applied within our own African context, especially in some societies? Thank you.
Thank you, Norbert. I will take Elvis' question and I will come back to the panelists. Elvis, please can you make your question very brief?
Yes, good evening to all the panelists and especially to Dr. Charles. So my question is, has democracy really worked for Africa since the new colonial era till present? If not, what is it that can work for Africa to make it better? Could it not be the failures or weaknesses that have led to the so many coups that we are having in Africa today? Could it be the failures or weaknesses that have led to the so many coups d'etat in Africa in recent days? What appraisal can the panelists give us about the democratic process in Africa? What is the use of the African Union in ensuring peace and stability in Africa with the several coups d'etat we are seeing every day here and there? And there are prospects that they might continue spreading in Africa. So what is the use of the African Union?
Many thanks, Elvis. We will ask the panelists to reflect on this and give their comments. I will start with Dr. Charles, please. Just reflect on the questions they have asked and please combine it with your last comments, your overall comments as we wind up the webinar. Professor Muriti, kindly respond to the two questions and give your concluding remarks, please.
Sure. Yeah, I think on the question of democracy, I'll say democracy is an ongoing project. Democracy is very much a promise that is perpetually pending to be fulfilled. And there's no country with a perfect democratic system. If you just think of countries in the West, US had the January 6th protests where democracy was under peril. We're not sure with the next elections coming up whether this might in fact undermine the very nature of democracy in America. Europe is flirting with a lot of right-wing movements which do not in fact hold democracy in high regard. This is how, for example, Hitler in Germany came to power prior to the Second World War in the 1930s. Essentially dealing with fascism in Europe, which can potentially undermine democracy. So in most countries around the world, democracy very much is a work in progress. I think it's often sounds like cliche, but it's just the reality of what it is. And equally in Africa, we shouldn't be shy to say we're still figuring it out. We're working towards, pursuing more democratic societies. So we cannot already make a pronouncement that democracy has failed in Africa, even with the military coups. So what is the underlying drivers of these coups? And if you look at what Professor Maklosa presented us with, it's clear that these are the significant underlying factors that have to be taken into account if we're really to understand how we're going to build sustainable societies going forward. I think that leads us to the question of the interface between academia, research, policy analysts, and not only the military leaders, but also the political leaders on the African continent, because the political leaders are the ones who make policy. The military leaders, in fact, are technically, you should be implementing it. And now when a military government establishes itself, the question is how is it going to transition towards a system where there is governance by the people that ensures transparency in governing and decision-making and citizen engagement participation. And that is essentially what we need to craft in a much more clear and precise way. There are elements of it in lots of our normative frameworks, but I think we need to restate this somehow in a much more significant way to revive not only, democracy within our societies, but also democracy across the continent, continental democracy through Pan-African Parliament, and indeed also globally, global democracy, and reforming the multilateral system, United Nations system, and the UN Security Council in particular, which is very undemocratic structure. So you can see this is a challenge and a problem on multiple levels, and really something that we all should apply our minds to. Thanks, Dr. Akinola.
Thank you so much, Professor Mulitsi, for your concluding remarks. And I also extend appreciation to the organizers, RFK, Dr. Shilika Tandy, and everyone involved with organizing this important conversation. We won't end the conversation here because it's something that is ongoing and you never know. One can wake up tomorrow and another set of military boys, like we used to call them, have taken over in other African countries. So please, let's keep the conversation ongoing and let's try also and engage more with the African Union to be familiar with some of their events, their programs and activities. Let me just invite my friend, Dr. Oluwaseun Teller, to give a reflection and close the meeting. Thank you. Dr. Teller, over to you.
Okay. Many thanks, Chair. As we draw this insightful webinar on the resurgence of military coups in the Sahel and the future of democracy in Africa to a close, I would like to express my gratitude to all of our distinguished panelists, participants, and organizers who have made today's event possible. Throughout our discussions, we have delved deeply into the complex and pressing issue of military coups in the Sahel region and their implications for democracy in Africa. We have heard from experts, scholars, and practitioners who have shared their invaluable insights, research, and experiences in this regard. The challenges facing the Sahel region, and indeed Africa as a whole, are formidable, but today's discussions have reaffirmed our belief in the power of dialogue, education, and cooperation to address them. We have examined the root causes of military coups, the regional dynamics at play, and the potential path towards ensuring the sustenance and deepening of democracy on the continent. It is evident that the future of democracy in Africa is intrinsically linked to the stability and the governance of the Sahel. The region's security challenges, political transitions, and socioeconomic disparities demand our collective attention and concerted effort. As we conclude this webinar, let us leave with a renewed commitment to fostering democracy, upholding human rights, and promoting peace and stability in the Sahel and across Africa. Let us continue the dialogue and collaboration that have been initiated here today, transcending borders and disciplines. Once again, thank you to our esteemed panelists and participants for your contributions, and thank you to our audience for your engagement. Together, we can work towards a brighter future for democracy in Africa. Thank you and goodbye.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.